Let's say there's a donut shop in a town, small town, not a gigantic town, but they're able to, you know, do their business, they're able to operate because people just love their donuts. But then let's say somebody else comes around and they're offering better donuts and they've shut up a shop up in the same town. And now the first donut shop is suffering business. You know, it's bad for them, right? Is that provocative? Are they provoking the donut shop? I think it's time to watch this man. God, man, he's got weird drip. We gotta watch Peter Zeihan. You guys have been telling me for a while. I've got my die-hard geopolitics fans in chat are constantly telling me, watch Peter Zeihan. What do you think of Peter Zeihan's stance on this? What do you think of Peter Zeihan's stance on that? This, that, this, that. It's time for us to finally watch Peter Zeihan on the show. First time ever. Actually, this is true. This will be my first time ever actually watching Peter Zeihan speak for an expanded period of time. Can you guys believe that? I've seen like a few clips and quotes there, and I can hear from those clips and quotes his like his geopolitic worldview as a geographic determinist, which I of course disagree with fundamentally. I believe ideology plays a strong role in a country's destiny. But this will be my first time. So I heard he did very well. I heard it was a very interesting performance, and that Zeihan, like after he went on Joe Rogan's show, I saw more and more people asking me about Zeihan, unironically. And so it seems like it has raised him to a higher level, okay? For those of you asking who Zeihan is, he will introduce himself probably at the start of this podcast. So let's full screen this baby. Let's watch the Peter Zeihan, Joe Rogan experience. Okay, let's go back here. Okay, 1 second. Okay, here we go. Let's watch. Boom. Ah, that's beautiful. Clear cut. I got the full thing on here, baby, so you guys better be ready. We might not watch the full thing. We'll stop once it gets boring, okay? We'll stop once it gets boring.
Peter, what's going on, man? Nice to meet you.
I hear, dude, the whole thing that I heard was that he made a really good defense for Ukraine in this. And so, again, considering Joe Rogan's audience and the type of guests Joe Rogan have on, which are a lot of people who are going to tell you we shouldn't be helping Ukraine at all, and that who cares about Ukraine, or this is all Ukraine's fault, or the West did it, it's really good to have somebody like Peter Zeihan in front of Joe Rogan's millions of listeners. A lot of people just don't want to engage with Joe Rogan at all. I don't think that's a smart thing to do. Definitely considering how gigantic his audience is and how much reach he has.
Right back at you. It has been a crazy year.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year for everything, right?
Yeah, it's one thing when you talk about how the world's going to be coming to an end. It's quite another when it's like here and now.
Yeah. Well, you've been working on this type of material, this subject matter for quite a long time. So tell everybody your background.
Let's see. My background's in economic development. It's all about figuring out what works where and why if you try the same policies in the next town over, it's usually a disaster. And then I worked actually here in Austin at a company called Stratfor for 12 years, and I was their sole generalist. So it was my idea to kind of plug everything together and figure out what the map of the world looks like, and how if you pull a string on one side of the world, something changes on the other side.
Blue Rider of
your
Neptune gave
perspective
Philippa Augusta
on
Tier 1 subscription.
sort of
Gutter Chat will never win.
My goodness, you guys are still beefing, man. Dude, gutter chat and site chat is like Bloods and Crips. But this kind of assumes they're on the same level, and of course site chat is superior, so it's more like, I don't know. What would be a better comparison? Maybe like Bloods versus U.S. Marines. I don't know. Blue Rider Neptune, though. Thank you so much for the gifted Tier 1. I do appreciate it.
Global interactions with China and Russia and the United States and the energy supply and the food supply, I have not heard before. I haven't heard it as comprehensively as I've seen you put it together, so I'm kind of excited to talk to you about this. So when let's I guess we should start it with Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, you were not surprised.
Not even a little. No.
You expected this. And you felt like this is inevitable, and this is just something that was always going to happen, and it's not going to just stop at Ukraine.
No, not even remotely. The Russian space is among the worst farmland in the world, and so they've never been able to generate enough income to have a road network. Everything has to be moved by rail. And their frontiers are just huge, and they're open, and if you've got a
In fact, he is right about the rail. I don't know if this was inevitable. I can't actually say that. I don't know if this is smart as a content creator. It's probably smart as an honest person. I don't know if it's smart as a content creator. But when I don't know something, I try to be very honest. But I don't know if this was inevitable or not. It's really hard for me to think that it was inevitable or not. It's really hard for me to figure it out. Because on one hand, right, we could talk about, was there ever a dream of liberal Russia that was a possibility? When people talked about Dmitry Medvedev possibly being a liberal reformer, was that really true? Could he have been that liberal reformer? Could there have been a reality where Russia joined the EU? Could there have been a reality where Russia's intelligence gathering apparatus was better when analyzing Ukraine and its own military capabilities and told Putin directly that if they were to launch an invasion of the style they are right now, that it would probably end in failure? If Putin wasn't there, would another person of similar beliefs of Putin, of that same kind of background of KGB security apparatus, working in the police force, I forget what they call it, there's a specific word for these types of people who have worked in these types of apparatus for the Russian state. Somebody will bring it up in chat. Somebody will know. I know you're all nerds. Would they have made the same decisions? How much was that decision to invade impacted by the people around him? Not the FSB. There's a word for it. I forget what it's called. There's a word for a total class of people who like work in Russian law enforcement apparatus, like the FSB, like the Russian police force, like Russian SWAT, those types. I forget what the name is. I think it's just with an S, but whatever. Would that still have happened? And I don't know if the answer for that is yes. I do think another person could have based themselves on the ideology of Ivan Ilyinev. I never know how to say his name correctly. That old Russian fascist philosopher, or hardcore Russian nationalism, still come to the ideas that that Ukraine is inexorably a part of Russia and we must annex it. It's a fake state. I do think Russian nationalism is not isolated to Putin and his cronies, right? So I do think other people could have made the ideological decisions that led them to this war, but he's more of a geographic determinist. So I don't know how much he really even weighs that when it comes into his calculations. For him, it's just like, and this is what I'm going to assume this is going to get into. Oh, well, if they take Ukraine, if the West has Ukraine, then it doesn't have a lot of natural barriers between Ukraine and Russia, and it's defensively for Russia not a great move, and Russia believes it has to control everything that touches it in order to have a good defense for the defense of Russia. Therefore, they were going to invade. As Russia faces, many, many other problems, economic, demographic, etc. So, but ideology isn't going to play much into that role. And to me, and this is the big thing that makes me think it's not inevitable, or it possibly could not be inevitable, it makes me kind of not know. I do believe that ideology played a role. I do believe that the ideology of Russia's elite and the path they chose after the intervention in Chechnya and Yeltsin handed over the staff to Putin, and the fact that these dreams of liberal reform were smashed with Dmitry Medvedev, I do think that had an impact. I do, absolutely. I also think just general Russian incompetence had an impact, and the failure of Russian intelligence had an impact. I think there's a million different things that led to this that I think are more expansive than geography, which is Peter Zeihan's usually his main concentration. I think, from what I've heard. I, again, not an expert on Peter Zeihan, haven't listened to a lot of his stuff.
Force that can't maneuver itself, your only reasonable defense strategy is to be forward positioned and use geography to help you out. So you expand until you reach mountains or oceans or deserts, and then you anchor on either side.
Look at that. The pre-watch, exposed as pre-watching. Exposed. Dylan's been exposed. No, I mean, he cares about geography, not that surprising.
Of those and plug the access points. Unfortunately for Ukraine, there are two of those access points on the other side of Ukraine. So the Russians were always going to try to push through and retake that territory that they had controlled for most of the last 350 years. Unfortunately for them, in the 35 years since the Soviet system.
I'm sorry, I like that comment from Site Chat from Philip. Zeihan was destined to say that because he grew up in Idaho or something. Okay, I should not be so mean to the geographic determinists, because they do make a lot of good arguments, but yeah, it is pretty funny.
Collapsed. The Ukrainians have developed an identity, and now they would like to be something other than a road bump.
I I disagree with what he says here. Then the last 30 years, Ukraine has created an identity. I don't know if he's being hyperbolic here or not. Ukrainians have been developing an identity for hundreds of years. There was a reason why during the Soviet Union there was a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was because even the Soviets had to recognize that there was something distinct here. It's the same reason why the Russians fought like endlessly, tried to oppress the Russian language, the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture, is because they recognized that distinctness. There was a reason people talk about Stefan Bandera, but the reason the UPA existed was because those people believed in Ukrainian sovereignty, believed in Ukrainian independence, and they fought for it, even if they weren't necessarily fucking great guys. But their existence is another point towards Ukraine existing. I'm not trying to make the argument, which a lot of people kind of like make with nation states, Ukraine exists because there it is, which, yeah, true, but this is something that's been talked about for a while. Voltaire talked about it in his old books and stuff. Not that I necessarily agreed with all of his conclusions when he talked about Ukraine, but he talked about it for a while. So this culture has existed for a while, and its identity has existed for a while. It's just, I think in the last 20 to 30 years, they've had the boot off their neck when it comes to their culture, and it's solidified more, and it's allowed to be more out in public, and now it's more present in public life, and this has not developed the identity, but helped solidify it and free it from being shackled, quite frankly.
So one of the narratives that was going around was that the reason why Russia was pushing into Ukraine is because NATO was moving their arms closer to the border of Russia.
There is something to be said for that. You just have to put it into context to really understand it. So the Russian point of view is for us to be secure, we need to expand until we reach a point where invaders cannot overwhelm us. We have to be able to plug those access points. But to give the Russians what they want, you have to sign over the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Belarus, Ukraine.
This is a great point.
Oh, let's go on. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all the stands. Basically, the Russians, in order to feel safe, they have to be able to occupy total populations that are twice of their own. And I'm sorry, but that's just not feasible. So, technically, the people who claim that NATO provoked this are correct. NATO can't have what it wants in Russia in order for Russia to feel safe. But for Russia to feel safe, they've got to occupy over 180 million people. And that was
a comparison I've used before, and I think this is a good comparison. When people say, when somebody says NATO provoked Russia, that they're saying that to imply that this is NATO's fault or the West's fault or America's fault. That's what's usually implied, right? But the thing is, even if we were to give that, here's a framing I would like to give you guys. Let's say there's a donut shop in a town, small town, not a gigantic town, but they're able to, do their business, they're able to operate because people just love their donuts. But then let's say somebody else comes around and they're offering better donuts. And they've shut up a shop up in the same town. And now the first donut shop is suffering business. It's bad for them, right? Is that provocative? Are they provoking the donut shop? Kind of technically, yeah. But if that donut shop owner was to go to the home of the other donut shop, the new one, and was to bash in their wife's head with a tire iron along with their kids to try to force them out of the town, whether or not that was at all provocative does, number one, not dictate whether it was right or wrong for them to set up a donut shop, and did not deserve that response. Some people will be like, oh, that's too graphic, that's too mean of a description to compare this to. Why would you? Honestly, I'm being a little light here, considering the amount of mass graves that have been uncovered in Ukraine. But I hope you guys get my point. Whether or not you consider that provocative doesn't necessarily dictate whether Ukraine, being part of a defensive alliance structure when it's actively being invaded by its neighbor, and has a historical kind of it happened in the 1920s that they were invaded by the Soviet Union and conquered. And they have been dominated by the Russian Empire and dominated by modern day Russia for the last 8 years through their war that they've waged against them. And then, of course, the February 24th invasion. It's not that crazy that after Russia agreed not to invade them, and said multiple times they wouldn't before proceeding to invade them, that they would want to join a defensive structure. Here is a good counter, besides, of course, this comparison. if you're saying that Ukraine provoked Russia by wanting to join NATO, I would say that Russia provoked Ukraine into wanting to join NATO by invading them and dominating them and economically coercing them away from working with European powers like the EU when it comes to economic arrangements. So if Ukraine provoked Russia into invading through, kind of flirting with NATO membership, Russia provoked Ukraine into wanting to join NATO through its actions towards Ukraine. Okay, let's get back to this. Let's get back to Peter Zeihan.
It's never part of the game.
So what do you think they anticipated was going to happen when they started the war?
Well, I don't think it was just the Russians who anticipated it. Ukraine, the last war in 2014, basically rolled over. They proved to be militarily incompetent, they were corrupt, and they couldn't put up any sort of resistance. Crimea fell in just a matter of a couple of days.
A little hyperbolic. There was resistance in Kharkiv. They took back Mariupol. But I largely it is true that the Ukrainian military did not put up any resistance in Crimea, basically whatsoever.
And I think a lot of us who are in the security side of things thought that this was going to be, to a degree, a bit of repeat. Now, excuse me, I was probably one of the more optimistic people for Ukraine because I had seen them develop a culture and seen them arm and train and had seen it be meaningful. But Ukraine's still a flat country, and the Russians are still one of the largest militaries in the world. So even I was saying that within 6 months to a year, this was all going to be over. But the Ukrainians have surprised to the upside, and probably most importantly, the Europeans didn't just roll over and let this happen like they did the last 7 times that
that
the
is the most important.
gone on the warpath since 1999. And that's changed the game fundamentally.
And when you look at it going forward, if people didn't anticipate that the Ukrainians were going to be able to fight back as well as they have, and then you look at it going forward, like where does this go?
Well, there's two paths here, and the problem is we haven't seen either side fight in their full glory yet, and until we have that fight, we really can't judge.
In their full glory, like meaning?
Well, the Ukrainians are the underdog, but they're in the process of rapidly arming with more and more sophisticated equipment. And by the time we get to May, they will have been able to do a lot of deferred maintenance on the equipment they captured from the Russians, which was more equipment than they started the war with. And there will be 60,000 Ukrainian troops that have trained in NATO countries with more advanced equipment back in the field. So, we get our Athens, if you will. On the other side, the Russians will have finished their second mobilization, and they will have at least another 500,000 men in the field. Now, they will be badly trained and badly equipped and badly led with low morale. But troops like that have a technical term attached to them. Russian. There's nothing about this war that is unique in Russian history. The first year is always an absolute shit show. And then the Russians throw bodies at the problem until it goes away. And in half of those wars...
Well, I mean, this is a little hyperbolic. This isn't true. I mean, it's true generally. But if you look at, for example, Georgia is an example of the Russians like, bam, done, they win. Like, right like that. Crimea, which they were just talking about, which is another example, you compare this to. The Crimean invasion, just bam, just like that. But I guess longer form war, like dragged out conflict, generally true.
The Russians ultimately win. So by the time we get to May and the mud season is over, we'll have a more advanced Ukrainian force fighting a much larger Russian force, and we will get our first real glimpse at how this is going to go, and we should know which way it's going to break. Now, it'll still take time.
By the way, I also want to say that one factor he is leaving out is the fact that I have friends in Ukraine who are not in the military who are telling me that the risk of them being mobilized goes basically up every month. And so as this is happening and the Russians are mobilizing, the Ukrainians are still continually mobilizing their troops as well. And I assume that's going to continue to happen up all the way until May. And so it isn't just like Russia's troop amount is going up, and Ukraine's is staying the same. Ukraine's is going up as well, even if it's not at the same pace, or they have less people to pull upon.
Time. Because if the Russians are going to win, it's going to take them a year to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, and then they have to occupy the country, and that's going to kill a couple million people. Or...
I enjoy hyperbole. I don't know how to fucking say it. Hyperbole? Hyperbolic? I know it's hyperbolic, but hyperbole. Is that how you're supposed to say it? That doesn't feel right. Hyperbole. No, that doesn't feel right. Hyperbole. 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 Thank you. Hyperbole. Thank you.
The Russians are going to be able to completely break the logistical supply chains that allow the Russians troops to even exist, and we'll have 500,000 dead Russians, and the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of Crimea in the east. And then we get to talk about the next stage, because this is just the opening phase of what is going to be a multi-year and perhaps even multi-decade conflict.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Multi-decade?
Welcome to Russia.
Multi-decade? Nah. It's not going to be a multi-decade conflict in Ukraine. I don't know what he means by that. If there's like a ceasefire signed, then it kicks over and something like that. Maybe I'm wrong, and I guess we'll find out eventually, decades from now. But the only way I see that happening is if there's like multiple ceasefires and there's like breaks in fighting, right? Because if you put the starting point in 2014, then I do think it's possible to get to a decade. Decades, though, it's going to take a lot of ceasefires, a lot of kicking cans down the road to get there. There's no way we're going to have this level of intensity of fighting for a decade. It's just not sustainable.
So, how do you think it goes? Like when May rolls around.
Yeah, ask me again in May. Right now, the balance of forces clearly are edging more and more towards the Ukrainians. They've proven to be more adaptable. When the Russians made it clear that they were going to do a second mobilization, that seemed to have broken the logjam in a lot of countries, most notably Germany. And we now have armored vehicles up to and including some light battle tanks, which I know all the tankies out there are going to hate that term. But
yeah, I am going to hate that term. Fuck you.
That have some...
No, Sorry, I just yelled at Michael Tracy for the same thing, so I have to yell at Peter Zeihan as well. I have to. I'm sorry. I am. Don't calling me tankies, by the way, okay? Just because we like being correct, okay? It does not mean we're tankies, because we're correct on our classification of what is and isn't a tank. And Bradleys are not tanks. And what the French sent are not tanks, okay? Abrams are tanks, okay? T-72s are tanks. Leopard 1s and 2s, those are tanks, okay? Infantry fighting vehicle, okay? Sorry, I gotta be that guy, yes.
Some serious firepower are going to be coming now. The Bradleys from the United States specifically.
I think this podcast was recorded before the British confirmed they're going to send 14 tanks to Ukraine, and they're possibly the start of a larger aid package of tanks being sent over. That is a big thing for me. That is big. And Germany has to give the okay from the tanks from Poland, from Denmark, from all these countries that are trying to send Leopards, that Germany won't okay. Germany makes the argument that they have to work with all these other countries in order to send tanks. That's the only time they're going to send tanks, send Leopards. Then UK announces they want to do it, and they are going to do it. Then we see Poland and all these other countries saying, okay, then we'll send the tanks. We'll send our Leopards if you can't send yours. And then Germany stands in front of these countries, stops them from sending Leopards, and now moves the goalpost to, actually, the United States has to send Abrams tanks for us to be able to participate in this. Like they're really they got to get on board with Poland sending the Leopard tanks, man. It's not even in their control anymore. They should give the okay to these tanks being sent from Poland. It's really ridiculous that they're not. Same with Denmark as well.
And that is it's a tool that the Ukrainians have not had. So every time the Ukrainians...
posing every 2 seconds, Nimrod. Oh, I'm sorry, Eagle Rifle 2022. You know what you could do if you want to just watch the Spotify video? Open up Spotify, go to Joe Rogan's podcast, and watch that. If you don't want my commentary, okay? Thank you very much. Nimrod, like what are you fucking? Jesus Christ! Like a carny is coming after me.
Have achieved a tactical breakthrough. They can only push as far as their infantry can run. Now their infantry is going to be mobile. And in a war of movement to this point, the Russians have proven that they're absolutely incompetent.
And why is that?
Part of it's graft. The guy who is the defense minister, Shoigu, he's arguably one of the least competent people on the planet.
True.
But he's a friend of Putin, and so he's been able to milk the Defense Department for everything. Best guess is that he has taken a third of the budget.
I mean, I'm pausing again. Nobody get too angry, okay? We gotta wait until we see that new German foreign minister who was just working in like Saxony up until now. Then after we see his performance, then we can address whether or not he's the most incompetent. Again, he works in the actual defense and not in foreign relations. Lavrov would be a better comparison, but man, I am waiting to see how that dude does. Like, he has like no experience whatsoever. Unpause. Okay. I'm sorry.
Budget himself for procurement, and his flunkies have taken another third. So very little gets to the military itself.
So it's corruption.
Huge corruption, and that means no training. Or if there is training, it's basically a parade. And when you're using a force that can only supply by rail, you're completely dependent upon trucks for local distribution, and that's why the Ukrainians went after the trucks with the all the javelins that they got early in the war. They didn't really go after tanks; they went after the trucks, and they've destroyed roughly 2,000, maybe 2,500 of them, and that has reduced the Russian military to going back to Russia, confiscating city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans, and bringing them back to the front. And think of a Scooby-Doo van. Now fill it full of artillery shells. You know, every time you hit a bump, and that is their primary ammo supply system now. Because the rail system into Crimea got blown up, the Kerch Bridge, and what's going into the east is all under artillery range. So they have to use truck, and they're just not very good at it.
Now, for a lot of people, the big fear is that if Russia starts really getting desperate, then they use nukes.
Sure, and it would have to be very desperate. I've not been as concerned about the nuclear question as some folks, because there's really only four scenarios. Scenario one is the Russians consider throwing one against the United States, but we've made it very clear from our intercepts and our sharing of information with the media that we know exactly where Putin is at any time. We're listening to his phone calls, we're reading his emails, and so he now knows very clearly that if he throws a nuke at the United States, we're going to throw one not at Russia, we're going to throw one at him. And there's no version of this where he survives. So he has tamped down the rhetoric quite a bit since last March.
While I don't necessarily agree with the statement, there's no version of this where he survives. I don't have that much confidence in American intelligence, and I don't have that much confidence in Putin's inability to hide himself. I do agree that the rhetoric has extremely tampered down since earlier in the war, because the Russians have basically come to the conclusion, which any rational person would, that if they were to use a nuclear device in this war, it would end up hurting them more than it would help them. It would be used as a weapon of terror if they were to use it against Ukraine, which is the only real viable scenario, I think, where they would do it. And it would end up with Ukraine getting more economic, more military, and radiological aid, more sanctions placed upon Russia, and might be one of the few scenarios where the Indians and the Chinese agree to a price cap on Russian energy exports. So there's like no benefit, not to mention if something goes wrong, or if he has confidence that they would even follow such an insane order. His generals are the people who would give the order to, the chain of command, whether it would function, radiological spillover. There's a million different issues, and I think they came to the conclusion, because we know they've considered it, they've probably come to the conclusion that it's just not worth it. They get much more power from these nukes through intimidation than they do through actual use.
Option number two, nuking Ukraine. That doesn't make sense. They want to occupy Ukraine. You don't want to have your troops in a place that's a radioactive wasteland. There may have been a case last year for nuking Poland and Berlin and Stockholm in order to disrupt the weapons flows into Ukraine.
I'm sorry. That killed me. I made like a little face at that, like, no, I don't think there's a case for that either. What? And then you look over at Joe Rogan, and he's wide like a deer in headlights. Look at that. I'm sorry.
You don't want to have your troops in a place that's a radioactive wasteland. There may have been a case last year for nuking Poland and Berlin and Stockholm in order to disrupt the weapons flows.
I'm sorry. That's, oh my God. Editor, there's the thumbnail right there. Use Joe Rogan's face right there. Perfect. That is that. I'm just terrified. I don't think there was a good case for it. It does disrupt. It would disrupt the weapons shipments to Ukraine. That is true. But if they were to do that, I still think the negatives would outweigh the positives, because now that was a strike on NATO, and now this is a NATO war. NATO is directly involved, and it's no longer Russia fighting Ukraine. It's Russia fighting all of NATO, United States, everything. And if they're fighting everything when they can't even beat Ukraine, odds are that does not end well. So I don't think there's a real logical case from there. That assumes, of course, the Russian leadership are thinking somewhat logically.
But after the battles of Izium and Kherson, the Ukrainians have more Russian gear now than they know what to do with. It's going to take them months to bring that all online. There's a lot of deferred maintenance that needs to be done. And so disrupting the weapons flows no longer is a critical issue because the weapons are already there. So the only scenario I can see where the Russians would seriously consider nukes is
disrupting ammunition flows, I think, would be useful. The less Ukraine can fire artillery shells, that would be something that could really help the Russian war effort. But I mean, he is right that they're capturing a lot of equipment. I don't think it's enough, but they are capturing a lot. A lot.
Is if Ukraine doesn't simply win, but decides to carry the fight across the border into Russia proper. In that scenario, where the very existence of the Russian government is threatened, that would probably change the math. But I don't find that likely without a significant shift in mindset in Washington, because we're not just providing the Ukrainians with the weaponry and the ammo, we're providing them with the intelligence and most of the steps of the kill chain. Without that, the weapons are of limited usefulness, especially at long range. And the Ukrainians have no desire to rupture that relationship. So we're talking about a theoretical that is at a minimum.
Well, I mean, if they were involved in the assassination of Dario Dugino, which they still deny, but if they were involved in that, then that was a little bit of the ruffling of the feathers. But that's not in any way comparable to how much they would ruffle the feathers if Ukraine was to say, we've won, now let's destroy Russia itself. That would be a totally different scenario, and all American support for that would basically immediately drop. And considering Ukraine wants to join the Western Alliance structure, it would make no sense for them to do it. Not to mention the odds of such an operation being successful is extremely questionable, to say the least.
7 months away, probably further.
This whole thing is such a terrifying conflict. Being that Russia is a nuclear superpower and the history of Russian wars, I mean, there's such a long history of sacrifice and death, and it's like they're accustomed to it in a way.
Oh, we can do better than that. We can make you a lot more depressed.
Okay.
So let me give you two things. Number one, the Russians are relatively casualty immune. They fight in an area where they fight with numbers. They've never been technologically advanced versus their peers. They've always just thrown bodies at it. So there has never been a conflict in Russian history where they have backed out without first losing 500,000 men. We're at about 100,000 now. We have a long way to go before the Russian military breaks.
So the Russians have lost roughly 100,000?
That's the best guess.
How many Ukrainians have been lost?
Probably about a third of that. But that is a third in terms of military forces. In terms of civilians, we really don't know.
Okay, I do not know where Peter Zeihan got those numbers that Ukraine's lost a third of 100,000. So what's like 33,000, Russia's lost 100,000. I mean, that sounds like that's just like straight up just taking like Ukrainian government numbers at face value. It's more. I would say it's more than that. I mean, I would have to see a source for that, because I would want that to be true. That would be if that is true, that is incredible news for Ukraine, horrible news for Russia. But that just sounds like an underestimate of Ukrainian casualties.
It could be as much as 250,000 at this point. We just don't know.
Really?
Yeah, well, the data exists on the other side of the front line. All we know are about what has happened in the territories that have been liberated. And if you think of things like Bucha and Izium, German radio intercepts told us as far back as May that there were at least 70 places behind Russian lines that had suffered massacres like Bucha. And when we've had additional liberation since then, it corroborates that general assessment.
So,
well, so that's piece one that you can be a little depressed about. The piece two, the Russians see this as an existential fight for their survival. They feel if they don't get those blocking...
Okay, can I also just say, his general assessment about civilian casualties, though, I am more in line with. 250,000 is like the highest number possible, but it is true because the number you'll hear from officials is like 7,000, and that's from like the UN. But the UN is like doing an insane underestimate. And I've even engaged, remember I was talking to the Libertarian vice presidential nominee for 2022, for 2020, I had my debate with him. I had a conversation with him. It's on my second channel, DylanBurnsLIVE. He used that number, and that actually kind of miffed me a bit because, like, that is the lowest possible estimate you could use. I would say, like, at the very least, it seems like 100,000 is like the bare minimum number they've probably hit. We don't know for sure. Again, the variations are very wildly, but like Mariupol alone has horrific death counts for civilians. It's insane.
Positions, they're doomed, and they're probably right. But we now know that the Russians are fighting so badly. They're doing much worse than the Iraqis did in 1992.
Really?
Oh, yeah. If we had a direct fight now between NATO and Russia, it would be 1,001 casualties. And I don't know anyone at the Defense Department.
That's hyperbole. Hyperbole. Thank you. I said it correctly. That's hyperbolic. It would not be, I think that's purposely hyperbolic, though. It would not be 1,000 to 1. Maybe like 10 to 1 would maybe be like re-entering reality, but he's not wrong of the general assessment that Russia is not in a state to go to war with NATO right now, and that's part of the reason why I'm so generally unafraid of a nuclear strike or anything that Russia could possibly do to provoke NATO into a full-blown war with Russia.
Who's happy about that? Because if the Russians see this as an existential conflict, and they know they can't hold a match to NATO, then nukes are their only option. So the primary reason why everyone in the West has gotten shoulder to shoulder on this is they know that if Ukraine falls and Poland's next, there will be a direct fight, the Russians will lose, and then there will be a general nuclear exchange. So there's plenty of really solid reasons to root for the Ukrainians on this one.
Jesus Christ. Now, when this whole thing broke out, what do you think the Russians expected Ukraine to just give up?
Absolutely. That's what happened in 2014 for the most part.
And what are the possible scenarios for Russia? I mean, if it seems like they're completely committed to this.
They are.
And if they don't win it?
The Russian position is that our demographic structure is in such diseased and aged and terminal decline that the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometime between 2050 and 2070.
Wait, let me hear that again.
And if they don't win it?
The Russian position is that our demographic structure is in such diseased and aged and terminal decline that the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometime between 2050 and 2070 anyway.
I don't think that's true. I don't think you can make that jump. I don't think you can make that assumption based upon Russian demographic decline alone. I don't think you can make that statement. The Russian state could weaken. It could do a lot of things, but say that, it's going to turn out the lights anyway by those days. That's the thing about Peter Zeihan. I think I'm getting the idea that he makes hyperbolic statements. I do think the things he's saying here, like Russian demographic decline is a big issue for Russia going forward. That's real. That's true. If Russia was to have an exchange with NATO, Russia would probably get the short end of the stick by 1.5 miles. That is very true. A lot of things he's saying is true, but he's taking them to like sometimes like the more radical extents because he's just looking at demographics. He's just looking at geography. He's maybe not just doing it, but those are the things that like mainly shape his framework as somewhat like a geographic determinist from what I know of him and from what I've heard of him. And so I think he's making a few hyperbolic statements here that I don't think he can fully back up. But I'm sure if he was asked about like 1,000 to 1, he might like adjust the numbers but this statement I would hope he would also reel in a bit because I do not think the Russian state is just going to naturally collapse in that time frame. Or if it does, I don't think that it's guaranteed as of right now, just based upon demographics alone, at the very least.
Anyway.
Yeah. they've had a series of big melon scoops out of their birth rate throughout the history. World War I, World War II, the collectivizations under Stalin, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse. And a lot of these stack on top of each other. And the biggest one stacked on top of the
Somebody's asking me what is the by the way, what he's talking about right now, he is correct about. But this is this what's in the flask is Mad Dog. It's just like pineapple flavored Mad Dog. So nothing too heavy. I think it's like 13%.
The post-Cold War collapse. So there are more Russians in their 50s than their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and teens. And then they lie about the data of the teenagers on down. Which means that there aren't enough Russians that have been born in the last 30 years to carry the ethnicity forward much farther. So they're thinking if they can
again, hyperbolic. Like, it is true the demographic is declined, but the idea that like in 50, 60, 70 years there will no longer be Russians, like just he's exaggerating again.
Position their military and plug those gaps now with their last generation of young people, then they can kind of die on their own terms 50 years from now.
Have they really thought about this in that term? Like,
yeah, this one way or another, this is the end of Russia. The question is whether it dies in the long term on their terms or in the shorter term when they're completely unmoored. Because if they fail to...
I don't think you can make these predictions based upon this war and demographics alone. I think we're going to have to see the internal politics of Russia play out, see how this war ends, and see the next 50 to 60 years of Russian policy in response to demographic decline and what they do, whether they try to encourage a lot of immigration or whatever they do in order to respond to these types of things. He's kind of like, I remember something I was told about war and fighting and combat and like nations at war, and this had an impact on me, a big impact, is a lot of people when they're planning, and this is true of just your everyday life, if you're competing against someone, you will like make a note of somebody. Let's say in a year ago you made a note that somebody had gotten to level 7 in a video game, so you do everything to get to level 8 a year later. And you check back in with them, say, hey, I got to level 8. And they say, oh, well, I got to level 10. And you're like, damn. People kind of just assume in their head that as problems come or like challenges come, that, you know, you respond, but the other person you're not paying attention to doesn't. And I'm kind of getting that vibe right now off of Russia and what Peter Zeihan's talking about. Like, they're not gonna go down quietly. And he's saying like go down on their own terms. Like it's a bygone conclusion. I don't think we can make that assumption at all.
To secure those borders, then they've got a 2,000-mile open border with countries they consider to be hostile, and they have no way of moving troops around in a way that would allow them to defend it. They'd just be waiting for somebody to come over and knock them over.
And you believe that they're aware of this, that they can't survive past 2050, 2070, right, whatever it is?
I think that's what's been driving them, because 2022 was the last year where they had a sufficient number of people in their 20s to even attempt this. So from my point of view, not only did the war always have to happen, it always had to happen by now.
Jesus. Now, is this just because of the nature of a dictatorship that's run by someone like Putin, that it's just completely mismanaged because he's just dominated the power structure and made sure that everybody falls in line with his ideology and his reign? Like, what caused all this to be so poorly managed?
Well, Russia has always been poorly managed and authoritarian, but under Putin it's taken a much darker turn because of the nature of the end of the Cold War. If you remember back to 1982, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev were FSB, well, then KGB agents who basically overthrew the old system of Brezhnev.
I think he got some of the names there wrong. Whatever. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Russian history, so who knows?
And took over and because they're the only ones who really had a full understanding of what was going on. They controlled the information. They were not able to save the system, and so it broke. And Putin is the successor to that legacy because he was also in the KGB. And we're now in an environment that between the terminal demographic structure of the Soviet/Russian system and Putin's personal paranoia. So he's gone through and purged what was left of the KGB, FSB, of anyone who has personal ambitions to succeed him. We're left with an entire political elite of only about 130 people. And Putin has removed anyone who has leadership ambitions.
Oh, geez.
Now, they all see the world the same way. They all kind of agree with Putin on what's at stake here. But it does mean that when this generation is gone, this is it. This is all the leadership talent that the country has.
So because of his sort of top-down approach, he's eliminated all the possibility of future leaders in some way.
Even if Russia did have a replacement generation coming up, and it doesn't, he's taken steps to make sure that they can't challenge him. And so any sort of leadership talent has left or been killed.
What did they hope happens? And how? I mean, when everything's going so poorly, like what do we know about how they're assessing things?
Well, they're obviously not thrilled with the way the things are. They're using one bit of propaganda after another to justify it, saying that, we're fighting all of NATO, or demons are involved. That was my personal favorite.
Demons?
Oh, yeah. When it came to the Kherson offensive and it became clear that there was more going on than just NATO weapons, the Ukrainians actually knew what they were doing.
It's either that there's NATO super soldiers, demon Satanism. I've seen that accusation thrown around in false little fake little Satanist shrines built up to help praise Azov or whatever. It's any number of reasons, all excluding the idea that maybe that Ukraine can fight. They're doing everything possible to just deny the fact that Ukrainians are really, 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 really emphatic in the fact that they want you the fuck out of their country.
They changed the line from that these are all Nazis to these are actually gay demons.
Gay?
Gay demons, yes.
Yes, dude, oh my God. I gotta say, I do feel some relief after having watched so much Russian propaganda where they repeat that line over and over and over and over, or watching Chechen commanders tell their soldiers, you need to fight the gay shaitan. Shaitan means demon, devil. In Ukraine, or your kids are gonna be gay. Finally having somebody bringing this to Joe Rogan and having him confronted with it. Oh my God, about the gay Jewish Nazi demons of Ukraine. Oh guys, God, honestly, it feels like a relief.
Oh, yeah. When it came to the Kherson offensive and it became clear that there was more going on than just NATO weapons, the Ukrainians actually knew what they were doing. They changed the line from that these are all Nazis to these are actually gay demons.
Gay?
Gay demons, yes.
What?
Yeah, Russian propaganda is a hoot.
Please explain the gay demons.
Oh, I don't know if I can explain it. I'm just saying that this is the official line right now, is that we have homosexual demons fighting us in Ukraine.
But why gay demons? Is there a mythology to that?
Not really. The guy who's in charge of the Orthodox Church is a Putin crony. Kirill is his name. He's kind of like the Eastern Orthodox Pope, if you will. And he has been a partner with organized crime and with Putin since the beginning. And so he is coming up with ever more creative approaches to the propaganda. And so this is a way of, how can I say this without pissing off half of the people listening? Imagine Trump using his influence with evangelical Christians to come up with a theological reason why something didn't go his way. It's kind of the equivalent of that. And so gay demons is what he came up with.
Gay demons.
Yes, and they ran with it. So that's on state propaganda now.
Really?
Yeah, it's
wild.
wild.
And what's the epicenter of the gay demons?
Oh, Kiev, obviously.
Kiev.
Yeah, so we've got a Jewish Nazi gay demon.
Wow.
Dude, I gotta say, it is unironically it's like a wave of relief hearing Rogan be like, damn, why didn't nobody tell me this? Well, this stuff is crazy. I had no clue that this was a mainstay in Russian propaganda. I had no idea. Just the wave of relief of damn, man, if you've got somebody intelligent in the room with Joe Rogan, he's not just gonna throw them out and be like, I reject everything. Oh my gosh, the relief of having him hear this and knowing that his audience heard this. It's really good, honestly.
Always weirder than fiction.
And the scary rumor is that Putin has cancer. And that...
Or Parkinson's is one I've heard as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. He's clearly on steroids, but, that could mean a whole lot of things.
God, I hate jumping to these conclusions, but Peter Zeihan is not somebody who strays away from making wacky or at the very least, bold conclusions. I don't like looking at photos of someone and being like, I can tell from this like specific like vein on their forehead that they have this disease. I don't like making those predictions because I've seen people do that with Kim Jong-un and they came up short. I've seen them do it with many world leaders and come up short. And I've seen people do that like on Joe Biden with no real physical or like medical evidence. And so I don't want to do that as well with Putin. But I mean, it is possible that he has cancer, and there are a lot of rumors about him being possibly sick, which could be true. We just don't know for sure. Definitely when he's like, what? He's like 70 years old. Yeah, he's 70 now. So it's not that crazy.
Or something along those lines. And you say that because of his appearance?
Yeah, he looks very, not just flushed, but puffy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a classic too many steroids in your system issue.
And this puffiness is these steroids are to battle this cancer somehow?
In theory, steroids keep you going in a time when you should probably be laying down is really the kind of the bottom line. Whether he's medicated, over-medicated, or medicated because of medical reasons, we really don't know. He's not in great health. That is obvious. And for someone who has been the shirtless horseback rider.
Again, like I'm not gonna jump to the conclusion that Putin's on steroids because he just looks puffy. Like I don't like jumping to that conclusion at all. I think he's making a pretty bold prediction here. Could be true, but we don't have enough evidence to make that claim. And he said that like pretty matter of fact as well.
The end of videos, that's a real problem. He's visibly wearing bulletproof or bullet-resistant vests, even around his own propaganda people. There was this great piece that came out that I saw last week where it was all the propaganda shots that he's taken with the soldiers' mothers and on the front and with the tech people and in the intelligence. And it was like the same 12 people were in every single shot, just in different outfits. And even with those people, he's wearing his ballistic vest.
Now, when you say, when you talk about his appearance that he's clearly unhealthy, is there, can you demonstrate that? Are there images that show him a couple of years ago versus now? Where you could see his appearance?
Yeah, it's not much of a reach. Like I said, he likes to pose shirtless on horseback to show how virile he is.
He didn't look good on shirtless on a horseback.
Yeah, I know. You got to look at it from the Russian point of view. I mean, the standards are a little different.
Are they?
Oh, yeah. And he's got the shakes. That's one of the reasons why the Parkinson's analysis, I guess, has come out.
I've never seen any of this.
Yeah,
so there's video of him.
Yeah.
We do not have hard evidence of this, and this is the one thing I still want, like some medical document leak or something. Which again, that's a very high standard to ask for. But I will say, due to his physical appearance, he is puffy, he is shaking. He is doing everything he's talking about. Like everything he's saying here is technically true. I just don't think we have enough hard evidence to come to these conclusions.
Shaking? See if you can find any of that, Jim. See if you can find a comparison.
Yeah, I got an article on like a timeline of his health.
Okay.
Here's the shakes part. Let's
Go.
see.
Yeah, and
It's a 3-minute video. So we'll
he
just
used to
watch
be
it,
a
I guess.
fairly animated speaker.
Boy, he does look puffy.
Yeah. Now, whether or not he's actually sick or not, I have no idea.
By the way, that's the worst possible video for Putin, because like it looks like he's literally holding the desk. Sorry about my coughing. he's literally holding the desk. It looks like he's holding the desk to stop himself from shaking. Couldn't have a worse video for him.
Of his health.
Okay.
Here's the shakes part. Let's
Go.
see.
Yeah, and
It's a 3-minute video. So we'll
he
just
used to
watch
be
it,
a
I guess.
fairly animated speaker.
Boy, he does look puffy.
Now, whether or not he's actually sick or not, I have no idea.
Could it just
There
be
we
that he's
go.
just drinking a lot?
Reel it in a bit. Thank you.
Technically, he says he's a
True.
teetotaler, which
Really?
is pretty rare in Russian society. But he's still alive, and a lot of Russians make it to his age,
How old is he now?
mid-60s.
Nope. Wait. No.
so-
Wait. No. He's not mid-60s. He's 70 years old. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, whatever. He's probably like, I don't check in on the age of every politician every few years. So somebody asked me what ages Rand Paul was, I wouldn't know.
It's just an appearance thing. We don't have any like real hard data that he's sick.
No, we do. Well, the folks in the intelligence world who are listening to his phone calls and reading his email might, but that has not been made public, to my knowledge, from the American side.
So Ukrainian military intelligence chief claims Putin is very sick and a coup is underway.
Yeah, but
What do you think?
Donov has been saying that there's a coup underway since March. So he's kind of the Ukrainian propaganda guy. I wouldn't put too much.
True.
How would
Credence in
that? But what would even happen there?
Well,
What if a coup did take place?
Putin has so thoroughly purged that what's left of the intelligentsia, there's only 130 of them, and there's probably only one of them who would have the guts to throw a coup. That's the Rosneft CEO. Rosneft is their oil monopoly. Igor Sechin is his name. He used to be a gun runner during the Soviet period. He's got the guts to pull it off. But if there's anything that the other 129 agree is that Sechin's an asshole and he should be shot on sight if he kills Putin.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, so there's no like immediate pretender to the throne here.
What a fucked up situation.
Well, for the Europeans who have been dealing with the Russians for 3 centuries.
Yo, Short Fat Otaku's in chat. Hello, Short Fat Otaku. How are you doing, Short Fat Otaku? Are you still short, fat, and an otaku? Just trying to check in, make sure you're still, true to name.
It's just a modern version of it.
Yeah. Yeah, the Soviet period was kind of a relief because we actually had an institution that pushed their weird religion to the side and actually worked on technocracy and technology. And from the European point of view, that was a huge improvement. And the belief in the post-Soviet period was that they would start from that and move forward and modernize and maybe even democratize. And people believed that for far too long, even when it was clear.
Hey, yo, can I ask a question? Okay, I'm gonna make this question public to risk my image. So I was talking to Short Fat Otaku, I think a month ago, about starting a podcast with him. Because I don't agree with Short Fat Otaku on everything. In fact, there's a lot of things we probably disagree with. He's a lot more right-wing than me. He's not like fucking Richard Mezzer or some shit, but he's like more right-wing than me. And for me, like, I don't understand why I'd want to talk to somebody on a podcast who I just agree with on everything. You know what I mean? Like, what's the point of a podcast if I'm just going to sit there and going to be like, I agree with this. I also agree with it. Like, that sounds boring, you know? And so I was thinking, like, Short Fat Otaku would be a good person to use because he's not like Sargon, right? He's not like insane. And we disagree on a bunch of stuff, you know? Thought it'd be a good choice. But, I don't know. What do you guys think? Think that's a good idea? Should I put all my chips on the Short Fat Otaku basket? Should I put it all there? They're quiet on you, Short Fat Otaku. At the very least, they're not opinionated. Not really? That sounds cool? No? So we got 1 endorsement, 2 rejections. It sounds like it could be interesting. I don't know, to be honest. Just got here. Is Rogan saying dumb shit about Ukraine? No, he's actually asking insightful questions. Anyway, just something to mull over. Just mull it over. Let's get back to this. If you want to burn your bridge with BreadTube, go for it. If they burn my bridge with BreadTube because I start a podcast, then like I don't like bye-bye, I guess. Like it is what it is. Like I try to be as cordial with everybody as I can, right? With few exceptions. But if that was something that really got to burn the bridge, then that'd be silly.
Degenerating rather than advancing itself.
Now, the title of your book is "The End of the World is Just the Beginning."
That's the one.
Why that?
We are dealing with the end of the world that we know. Russia is more of a symptom of this than a cause. So, to go back a little bit, in the world before World War II, if you had coal, oil, food, and iron ore, you could industrialize and try to make something of yourself. But if you failed to have one of those, you were probably a colony. At the end of the war, the Americans abolished the imperial system and patrolled the global oceans for everyone. And as a result, now you only needed one of those 4, and you could trade for the others. And so for the first time in human history, we were all on the same path, from different starting points and going at different speeds, but we were all industrializing and we were all urbanizing. The problem, well, let's start with the opportunity. When you urbanize, you move from the farm and into town to take an industrial job. When you live on the farm, you have a lot of kids because they're free labor. You move into the city, you have a lot fewer kids because kids are no longer free. They're really expensive and noisy and annoying and dirty pieces of furniture. And you have fewer of them. And so your population starts to shift. It used to be that you have loads of children, a few young adults, fewer retirees. It's kind of a pyramid. But as you urbanize, your pyramid opens up into a column because you have fewer kids, but everyone's living longer. And as long as your population is a column, economic growth is spectacular because you don't have to spend a lot of money on your kids. you're not old enough that you have a lot of retirees, but you got a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to build things and buy things, and then a lot of people in their 40s and 50s to do the investing. And the rich world was a population column from 1945 to 1992. And with the end of the Cold War, the developing world became a column in 1992 until now. The problem is that this is all temporary because birth rate keeps dropping, people keep living older, and your column eventually inverts into an open pyramid, upside down. And now you no longer have children, you no longer have a replacement generation at all. And there aren't enough people in their 20s and 30s to buy everything. And there aren't enough people in their 40s and 50s to pay for the retirees. So this decade was always going to be the decade that...
So this right here is part of the reason. Everything he's talking about, like the demographic nature of like how society has evolved. This is the same reason why Patrick Zeihan, I'm going insane, why Peter Zeihan comes to the conclusion that in the next 5 years, there's going to be some sort of like economic collapse in China, is because due to, in part, the one-child policy, which I think is a great example of how ideology can impact the future of destinations. Something against all you geographic determinists out there, but also just due to like the demographic decline of China and the idea that they don't have enough young people to pay for old people's service and stuff like that, that's going to cause so much economic pressure that in the next 5 years, before 2030, China's going to face some sort of like economic collapse in some capacity. I believe this is a bold claim that, I mean, if it happens, he will be probably viewed as one of the most brilliant geopolitical analysts of all time if he was unironically able to predict this. But I think it's such a bold claim. It also assumes, like I talked about earlier, this idea that like as the demographic decline happens, China does nothing to supplement it, either through fiscal policy or trying to bring up new people and like having, you know, like new policies to try to promote births, or possibly the removal of the one-child policy, which for example happened. I do think he accounts for that, but also not accepting more immigrants to fill up these holes and stuff like it almost like, I don't want to assume that China's just going to stand there as their population collapses in on itself demographically. It doesn't make any sense for China to do that. No state would just sit there and let that happen, unless you're Japanese, apparently. If you're Japan, then you just, then you will. But even they're even looking at trying to loosen these types of regulations and such. Anyway, I think now he's moving off the topic of Ukraine and moving more towards demographic stuff. And we've watched already like 27 minutes of the Joe Rogan Experience. I do not know how much of this I want to steal from Joe Rogan as a thief like I am. Okay, I don't think I want to steal too much.